She was bleeding out on a delivery table, giving birth to triplets she might not survive. And her husband walked in, not with flowers, not with fear in his eyes, but with divorce papers. He looked at his own newborn children and said 5 words that nearly killed her. "They're not mine. Sign this." But here's what he didn't know. The nurse standing right behind him? She was holding a lab report that would destroy every lie he'd ever told. And the woman he trusted most, the one who whispered those lies into his ear, was about to lose everything in front of a room full of witnesses. This is the story of Harper Sullivan, a woman who was betrayed by her husband, hunted by a father who abandoned her 15 years ago, and targeted by a stranger who wanted to steal her life. She flatlined on that hospital bed. Her babies were kidnapped from the NICU. A gunshot rang out in a dark alley, and through all of it, the one person who fought hardest for her wasn't the man who put a ring on her finger. It was the doctor who put his entire career on the line to save her. What happens next will leave you speechless. This story will teach you one brutal truth. The people who are supposed to protect you are sometimes the ones you need protection from. And your real family isn't always blood. It's whoever shows up when the world walks out. If you believe that the truth always finds a way out, drop a comment and tell me. Have you ever discovered someone you trusted was lying to your face? Hit that like button if you're ready for this story. Subscribe so you never miss one. And share this with someone who needs to hear that survival is the greatest revenge. Now, let's begin.
This city can really grind you down, especially if you have a gentle soul like Harper. She learned that lesson long before this nightmare unfolded on the delivery table. Her apartment in Astoria was one of those classic walk-ups where you feel the winter drafts in your bones and the summer humidity sticks to your skin. The kitchen was tiny, the bedroom not much bigger, but she'd made it a home. She showed me the little wooden crib she found at a thrift store, so proud of the sanctuary she was building. Every morning, she'd ride the N train to our world at St. Victoria Medical Center on East 68th Street. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it gave her a place to belong. The scent of antiseptic, the steady beep of the machines, the rattle of med carts, that was her rhythm. Cole existed in another New York. His life was in boardrooms on the 42nd floor of some Park Avenue skyscraper, making deals that were worth more than our entire nursing staff's annual salary. He drove a black Mercedes. We took the subway. He wore a watch that cost more than my car. He belonged in that world. And the more he belonged there, the less she belonged with him. Their life started in a small apartment and was ending in a penthouse she felt like a stranger in. He stopped taking her to his work events, saying a nurse didn't project the right image. He came home late, or not at all. His world was marble and glass. Hers was linoleum and latex gloves. I'll never forget the night she went into labor. Snow was pounding the city. She called him first, 3 times, but he was at some black tie event at the plaza. She took a cab by herself, white-knuckling the seat through every contraction. When she arrived, she was drenched in sweat and absolutely terrified. At the plaza, champagne glasses were clinking. In our maternity ward, alarms were blaring. Her blood pressure crashed. Doctors were shouting orders. All I could hear was Harper's ragged breathing. We were all fighting for her, for them. Cole only showed up after the worst was over, when the babies were breathing on their own. He didn't ask how she was. He didn't even look at the infants. He just pulled out those divorce papers and told her they weren't his. I have seen people at their worst, at their most broken, but I had never witnessed such calculated cruelty. But he underestimated our hospital, and he underestimated Harper. He thought he was in control, but in a hospital, the paperwork tells the real story, and someone had made sure the right story was documented. Months ago, seeing her so anxious and alone, I gently suggested she get a prenatal paternity test done, for her own peace of mind. She did. So when Jenna walked in, holding that chart, holding the official lab report, with the true father's name printed in black and white, I knew the storm was about to break over him. I had stayed silent for too long, but my small push for the truth was about to give Harper her voice back model. I first saw the rot months ago. It walked into our clinic wearing a tailored suit and a polite smile that never reached its eyes. Cole Maddox. His wife, Harper, glowed with her pregnancy, but he barely looked at her. He looked at his junior analyst, Verena Lowe, who trailed them like a well-dressed shadow. Her deference was a performance. I saw the hunger in her gaze, sharp and cold. It wasn't ambition for a job. It was for a life she was methodically planning to steal. I saw it all, and I said nothing. Just another messy marriage, I told myself. It wasn't my place, a lie I'd come to regret. The day Harper was admitted, I saw that handshake. Verena's touch was sterile, her eyes dismissing Harper's simple sweater with a flicker of contempt. "Cole talks about you sometimes," she'd said, the words dripping with false sweetness. Even then I felt a chill. There was a certainty in her voice, a predatory confidence that made no sense. I realized now she must have already known his secrets, already found a weakness to exploit, a lie to build her future on. Night after night, I'd see them leaving the hospital offices late, her voice a low murmur of sympathy. She was planting the seeds of doubt, and I was just charting at the nurse's station, pretending not to notice. She told him the lie so often he started to believe it. My hands shake just thinking about it. And he listened, because his pride was more fragile than his love for his wife ever was. In the waiting room, I watched her orchestrate his cruelty with the skill of a puppeteer. A comforting touch on his arm, a whispered word. She was perfecting her role as the grieving partner before the tragedy had even fully unfolded. So when my colleague asked, "Are you the father?" I saw Verena's mouth curve into a knowing smirk. She was ready for his denial. But what she wasn't ready for was the truth. A truth I was holding right there in my hands. A reckoning was coming. You could feel it in the way the air in the hallway grew thick and still. We all pretended to be busy, updating charts, checking monitors, but every one of us was watching them, watching Cole stand there with divorce papers while his wife fought for her life. Verena was at his side, of course, her quiet performance of support making my stomach turn. Every so often, her fingers would brush his sleeve, a silent claim of ownership. That's when my silence started to feel like a betrayal. And as I walked toward them, I knew their perfectly constructed world was about to break apart. It started with a single signature on a hospital form. I held the clipboard like a shield. "Sir, are you the father?" The question was standard procedure, but the air crackled around it. Cole looked to Verena, who gave him a subtle, encouraging nod. He was about to deny his own children. But I cleared my throat, my voice louder than I intended. "It's a formality. The chart already lists Dr. Rowan Hale as the emergency legal signatory and guardian." I saw the blood drain from his face, and for the first time, I didn't feel pity. I felt the first spark of justice. "We just need confirmation for the permanent records," I continued, keeping my tone professional. Cole's face was a mask of confusion. "What did you say?" Verena stepped in, her voice sharp with panic. "That's a mistake. Dr. Hale has no right. Cole is their father." I looked down at the chart. "You signed a pre-delivery refusal of parental rights, sir. The hospital appointed the attending physician as guardian during the medical emergency." I remembered watching Verena push those papers at him, telling him they were just liability forms. He hadn't even read them, and in that moment, she knew she'd overplayed her hand. The hallway doors slid open, and there was Dr. Hale. He looked exhausted, scrubs stained from the battle. He'd just fought for Harper, but his eyes were on fire. He walked straight to Cole, his presence silencing the murmurs around us. "You weren't here," he said, his voice low and cutting. "She needed you. They needed you. Someone had to make a choice." Cole, sputtering with wounded pride, shot back, "You had no right." Rowan moved closer, and the fury in his voice was for all of us who had watched and done nothing. "And you had no heart. You walked out on her." A wave of shock went through the waiting room. I saw the phones come up, saw the whispers turn into horrified gasps. For the first time, Cole looked like what he was, a villain in a story he thought he controlled. Rowan wasn't finished. "Your children are alive because of the people in this building. Harper is alive because she is a fighter. And you?" He let the word hang in the air, a judgment all its own. Then the alarms shrieked from Harper's room. Her heart was failing. Cole froze. Rowan was already running, and as they burst through the door, I knew my own silence had to end right now. I was one of the first ones back in the room. I saw it all. The frantic rush, the orders being called out, the fight to pull her back from the edge. But what I'll never forget was the single tear that slipped from Harper's eye. It wasn't a cry of pain. It was a tear of surrender, the kind you cry when the person who was supposed to be your anchor is the one who cut the rope. I'd heard his final words to her, the ones that broke her spirit before her body started to fail. That quiet, final act of cruelty echoed louder than all the alarms. My hands worked on autopilot, prepping the crash cart, drawing meds. "They're not mine." His voice was in my head, a venomous whisper. How could anyone say that to the mother of his children in her most vulnerable moment? The monitors blared, a soundtrack to our frantic efforts. A mask went over her face. Someone called for Dr. Hale, but he was already there, a blur of motion at her side. He was a force against the chaos, his presence a promise that we wouldn't let the darkness win. He was fighting for her when the man who should have been holding her hand had already left. "Harper, stay with me." His voice cut through the noise, calm and commanding. "I've got you." I saw another tear slide down her cheek, but this one felt different. It felt like hope. "BP is dropping," another nurse called out. His hand found hers. A lifeline in the storm. "Think of your babies," he urged. "They need their mom." Her heart faltered, a terrifying flatline, then a flicker, a weak beat. As he worked, I slipped away for a moment. I took the form Cole had signed, the one Verena had given him. I placed it in a legal evidence bag, and on the chain of custody label, I wrote a note detailing my observations of their behavior. It was a small thing, but it was my voice, finally breaking the silence. And it was a start. I remember the sounds first, all twisted and wrong. Her collapse felt like the whole floor went silent, holding its breath. Then, from outside her room, a man's voice, sharp with disbelief and fury, cut through the quiet. "What the hell do you mean her babies are under another guy's name?" A woman, Verena, answered, her voice shaking. "They're saying a Rowan Hale is on all the paperwork." I saw the flicker of pain on Mrs. Maddox's face right before she went completely still, and I knew I'd heard something I shouldn't have. For hours, she was a ghost in that bed, just a faint pulse on the monitor. When she finally woke, the room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the machines I was there to check. Her breathing was even, the air still and cool. But I wasn't the only one there. Dr. Hale sat beside her, looking like he'd been through a war himself. His scrubs were a mess, and he looked exhausted, but his gaze was fixed on her. The moment her eyes met his, I saw a kindness there that made my own heart ache for her. "You gave us quite a scare," he said, his voice low. She tried to answer, but it was just a rasp. He was already pouring her water, holding the cup so gently. I hadn't seen her husband, not once. When she could finally speak, her first words were for them. "My babies, are they all right?" "They're fighters," Dr. Hale assured her. "In stable condition for now." I watched relief soften her face, but it didn't last. A shadow moved across Dr. Hale's expression, a pain he couldn't quite conceal. "Harper, we have to discuss something." Her own heart monitor picked up its pace. What was it? What did I hear before I blacked out? He took a deep breath. During the emergency, a legal guardian had to be listed. Cole wasn't reachable. You were unresponsive. It's protocol. "So you—" she whispered. "As the attending physician, I signed," he confirmed. Then quieter, "The children are listed as Hale, until it can be legally amended." I saw her flinch. The idea of her children tied to a stranger, even one who saved them, felt so wrong. "That isn't the main problem," he said, his voice dropping. "Cole's medical records, they were tampered with." She just stared. "Tampered with? How?" He stood and grabbed a chart from the counter, his motions deliberate. Someone went into his file. They faked lab results, wrote in false diagnoses. He looked right at her. "Cole is not infertile. He never has been." The room felt like it was spinning, even for me. "But the papers," she stammered. "He showed me papers that said—" "He thought they were authentic," Dr. Hale explained. "But someone with system access manipulated his entire health profile." The name hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. Verena. A chill went down my spine. Dr. Hale kept going. "And there's something else. The NICU ran extra genetic panels for emergency blood typing." I held my breath. "What were the results?" He paused for a beat too long, and I saw the dread in her eyes. "The triplets are a 99% match to Cole. They are his biological children." Her breath just stopped. All those months of her being called a liar, the divorce threats, the cruelty, it was all built on a fabrication, a lie designed to destroy her. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would anyone do that?" His own anger was a low fire in his eyes. "You should also know that Verena Lowe wasn't just his analyst. She was in your nursing program years back." Harper's expression froze. I watched her memory click into place. Verena's smug smile, her cold eyes. "She tried to ruin you before," Dr. Hale said. "Your scholarship, your recommendations. She's done this before." I felt the blood pounding in my ears. This wasn't bad luck. It was a targeted attack. Just then, a frantic knock rattled the door. Another nurse leaned in, out of breath. "Dr. Hale, we've got a situation at the NICU. Someone's demanding access to the triplets." Dr. Hale's face went hard as stone. "Who is it?" he asked. The nurse hesitated. "It's Cole, and he's with Verena." I saw the terror flash in Harper's eyes, and I knew this wasn't over. The next day, everything was different. When I went into her room, she was sitting up, not huddled under the blankets. The fear was gone, replaced by something solid and unbreakable. The shock, the near-death experience, it had forged her into someone new. Someone who had spent too long making herself small for a man who tried to crush her. She was done begging for a love she never really had. A gentle tap on the door, and I entered with a small rolling mirror. "You asked for this earlier," I said softly. "Are you ready?" "Yes," she breathed out. "I need to see." I wheeled the mirror closer. She waited a long time, steeling herself for what she'd find. But when she finally looked, she didn't see a victim. She saw a survivor. There was color in her cheeks. Her hair was a mess, but her eyes were clear, fierce. Up this I saw it too. A strength that had been buried for years. "Let me help you," I offered. We braided her hair and smoothed the sheets. It was a small thing, but it felt like she was putting herself back together. When Dr. Hale came in later, he stopped short. "You look—" He couldn't find the word, but I saw it on his face. Different, stronger. She gave a faint smile. "I feel it." He pulled a chair close, his tone turning serious. "The NICU is on lockdown. Cole and Verena are barred from the floor." The fear was a ghost, no longer haunting her. "Good," she said simply. "Their control over my life is over." He watched her, a hint of awe in his eyes. "You're not the same." "No, I'm not." She looked toward the morning light. "I spent so long trying to be what he wanted, to earn my place. I was living in his shadow." "You were always meant for the sun," Dr. Hale said quietly. She went on, her voice firm. "Once I'm out of here, I'm getting a lawyer. I want new DNA tests, the records of the fraud, everything. I'm not backing down. If he wants a fight, he'll get one. But I'm not going in defenseless this time." He nodded, his respect for her clear. "Whatever you need, I'm here." But she shook her head slightly. "This is my battle." Still, he reached into his jacket and gave her an envelope. "What is this?" she asked. "A weapon," he said. It was a business card for a law firm I knew by reputation only, the kind that didn't lose, the kind of power money buys. Harper looked stunned. "Rowan, there's no way I can—" "The retainer is paid," he cut in. She just stared at him, speechless. "Why are you doing all this for me?" He hesitated, 1,000 unspoken things in his eyes. "Because it's long past time someone was on your side. Because you deserve to be safe, not just to survive." Before she could reply, his voice echoed from the hall. Sharp, demanding, Cole was here again, and I could hear Verena's voice right beside his. What happened next, on the 42nd floor, became a legend around the hospital. They say the boardroom was so still you could hear a pin drop, with the city skyline watching like a silent jury. It wasn't just another meeting, it was a reckoning. Harper Sullivan arrived to dismantle the man who nearly broke her. And she wasn't by herself. Dr. Hale was with her, along with 2 lawyers who looked like they'd never lost a case in their lives. Harper wasn't wearing a hospital gown anymore. She wore a green dress that made her look powerful, her back straight, her head held high. She wasn't the woman Cole threw away. She was a mother who had come back from the brink to fight. And he never, ever saw her coming. I heard Cole was standing at the head of the table, his arrogance starting to fray at the edges. Verena stood next to him, trying to look like she belonged there, but her eyes kept nervously flitting around the room. "Let's just finish this," he reportedly snapped, desperate for control. "You have no right to be here." That's when Dr. Hale smiled. "Actually, we do." He slid a file across the polished table. "The board invited us." A shockwave went through the room. The lead board member, a formidable older woman, spoke up. "Mr. Maddox, your wife, your legal wife, has brought forth some very grave accusations concerning medical fraud, emotional distress, and unauthorized attempts to enter the neonatal unit." His face turned beet red. "It's all lies. She's unstable. I remember when the whispers began, and I stayed quiet. Now, my silence is deafening as Harper speaks. Her voice like steel. She slid over the files. First the corrected fertility results, then the digital trail proving who faked them. Verena's face went white as screenshots filled the screen, every click tracing back to her. "No," she breathed. Rowan's voice was ice as he detailed it all. Stolen credentials, forged documents, a plot to destroy a marriage, and a breach attempt at the NICU. The room was chaos. Cole staggered back, betrayed. You did this?" Her answer was pure venom. You were supposed to leave her for me. I had seen this for months and called it loyalty. My mistake. That was obsession, Harper said quietly. Verena lunged, fingers shaking. He's mine. Just then, security grabbed her. Verena shrieked as they took her arms, but Cole didn't lift a finger to help. Her final threat echoed as she was dragged out. You'll all regret this. In the quiet, Cole pleaded, panicked. She's lying to ruin me. But Harper was already opening the final folder, the one containing the results that would prove Cole's biggest lie. You were the father. Harper's voice was soft, but it landed like a bomb. And you left your own children. We all held our breath. I watched Cole sway, his whole world crumbling. Rowan put a hand on Harper's shoulder, a quiet signal. You did it, he murmured, but she wasn't finished. She faced Cole, her voice shaking but strong. This is just the beginning. At that exact moment, the chairman called for the vote on Cole's future. It was quick. One by one, the hands went up. The men who once praised him now cast him out without a second thought. Just silence, as his kingdom fell. I saw Cole's throat work, trying to swallow the shock. You can't, he stammered. I built this. The chairwoman was unmoved. And you almost destroyed it. She listed his failures: recklessness, ethical breaches, negligence. We can't trust you. I watched Harper. She just stood there, no triumph on her face, just resolve. Cole turned on her, his eyes wild. You're turning them against me. Harper's soft reply was devastating. No, you did that all on your own. He scanned the room, looking for an ally, but there was no one. Verena was gone. We all just stared back, our faces blank. He was completely alone. When security came for him, he stumbled. I'm not leaving, he insisted. This is my company. But there was no fight left in him. The guards took his arms and led him out, his body sagging under the weight of it all. He had dodged consequences his whole life, and now they had finally caught him. Just before the door closed, he looked back at Harper, his eyes filled with a fear I'd seen in her face once. After he was gone, the room breathed again. The board members nodded at Harper, not with pity, but with respect. She had faced it all and won. Rowan stepped to her side, his voice low. I couldn't hear what he said, only saw her shake her head. No, not yet. He looked at her, confused. What's left? Her chin lifted. My children need protection. Cole will do something crazy now. Rowan nodded. Then we prepare. I watched them leave and saw the flashbulbs erupt in the lobby below. The news was already out. CEO fired in a paternity scandal. I saw Harper flinch from the lights, but Rowan moved to shield her. It's okay, I imagined him saying. I've got you. His presence was a shield, and I felt hope that maybe, for the first time, she wasn't going through this hell by herself. She finally looked like she wasn't just surviving. As they moved through the chaos, I could see the weight lifting off her. She'd walked through fire and hadn't been burned. Still, I overheard her question as they passed my office. Do you think he'll just disappear? Rowan's answer was grim. Men like Cole don't disappear. They retaliate. I saw her swallow, her fear returning as she stared out at the snow. Then I need to be ready. He promised he would make sure she'd win. But as she started to reply, his phone buzzed. I saw his face fall. What is it? She asked. He tensed. It's the hospital. I felt her freeze from across the floor. Someone tried to get into the NICU again, he said. And it wasn't Cole or Verena. I couldn't follow, but news travels fast. An unauthorized attempt. A person who fled. My friend in security filled me in later. Harper rushed through cold hallways, heart pounding for those 3 tiny babies. She'd survived everything, But this was a different kind of fear. She'd gasped, "What happened?" Rowan's reply was clipped. An intruder in the restricted wing who ran when spotted by the staff. She asked if they got inside. "No," Rowan said, but they were close enough to scare everyone. They reached the NICU entrance, where guards stood stiffly. One guard explained they had reviewed the footage. The suspect wore a visitor badge, but it was an old one. "How did they get it?" Harper had whispered. The guard didn't know, but he had something else. My stomach twisted just hearing about it. "Ma'am," he'd said to Harper, "the badge was issued under your name." Her knees must have buckled. "My what? I didn't request any badges." Rowan's jaw clenched. "Someone is spoofing her identity." Panic crawled up her spine. It couldn't be Cole. Not even he would risk that. And Verena was in custody. So who was left? Rowan had gently guided her inside to check on the babies. They entered that quiet room of beeping heart monitors, sacred ground. She must have rushed to the incubators, holding Noah, Grace, Bishi, and Oliver, her whole world. I can picture her touching the glass, whispering, "Mommy's here." He reassured her they were okay, that nothing was tampered with. The relief must have been a thin, fragile thing. "Someone's targeting them," she'd said, her voice trembling. "Why? What do they want?" My security contact filled me in on the rest. Rowan cleared the room and laid out his theory. "This might not be about Cole." "Who else?" she had asked, bewildered. He explained the intruder first went to the supply cabinet. "For the blood type charts," Rowan said. "Someone wasn't there to harm them. They wanted DNA confirmation." And then it hit me. An email I'd seen by mistake. From Verena to an outside lab with a name I recognized. My hands were shaking, but I pulled out my phone. I sent an anonymous text to Rowan's security chief. After months of silence, it was the only thing I could do. That face. I still remember the look on Dr. Harper's face when she saw it. My job was to monitor the babies, but I couldn't look away. I saw the breath leave her body as the nurse showed her the tablet. Security had cleaned up the image. The man wore a hood, but it wasn't enough to hide him. Dr. Harper went pale. She knew him. A ghost from 15 years ago, her father. The man who was supposed to be gone forever was now at the door of her children's lives. I just stood there, a silent observer, as her past came crashing down. The grainy photo on the screen seemed to suck all the air out of the room. He was older, but it was him. Her father, Patrick Sullivan. The man who left without a trace, leaving a mountain of debt and a broken family. I heard her whisper, "What is he doing here?" The question was so fragile, so full of pain. Dr. Hale tried to be gentle, taking the tablet from her shaking fingers. "We learned he'd used a stolen ID to get in." Gishug. The name meant nothing, but the act was everything. I saw the memories hit her, the eviction notices, her mom working herself to the bone, the weight she carried when her mother got sick. Dr. Harper had learned young that you couldn't always count on people. I don't think she ever thought he'd come back, especially not like this. Dr. Hale moved closer to her, his voice low. "Harper, when did you last see him?" 15 years ago, she whispered back, and the words felt heavy enough to break the floor. He just left. No calls, no money, not even a word when her mother was dying. I thought he was dead. Her voice fractured on that last word. I saw the pity in Dr. Hale's eyes. He suggested desperation, but Dr. Harper just shook her head. He was never desperate enough for them. She looked over at her babies, so small and fragile, and I saw the fierce protectiveness in her eyes. The idea of that man anywhere near them made my own skin crawl. I lingered nearby, pretending to adjust a chart. "There's more," I finally said. "Someone with his name, had asked for a consult with our genetics team that morning. Her eyes shot to mine, wide with confusion. Genetics? Why? Dr. Hale gave me a knowing look, a heavy one. Harper, he started, there's a possibility your father is sick. The word hung in the air. Sick? Dr. Hale explained it carefully, how some genetic conditions need a close relative for treatment. Sometimes a grandchild. The world seemed to drop out from under her. No, she breathed. He doesn't get to come back here and demand a thing. He won't use my kids as some kind of cure. Dr. Hale put a hand on her arm to steady her. You don't have to decide anything now, but we need you to have the facts. I watched her swallow, her pulse probably racing, all those old wounds tearing right open. But why steal an ID? She asked. Why sneak in instead of just talking to me? I lowered my voice. Because we denied his request. He has no legal right to information about you or the babies. He was trying to bypass protocol. I saw a storm of anger and fear brewing in her eyes. She knew him, charming one minute, cruel the next. But this felt planned, calculated. Dr. Hale hesitated, then reached into his pocket. There's something else. He handed her a folded piece of paper we found near the entrance. Her breath caught as she unfolded it. I recognized the jagged handwriting from the file. It said, Harper, I need your children. Don't make this harder than it has to be. The paper trembled in her hands. Dr. Hale took the note from her just as it was about to fall. This wasn't about forgiveness. This was about taking. Before anyone could say another word, an alarm shrieked through the unit. It was a code from our NICU, and it sent a wave of ice through my veins. A fellow nurse ran into the hall. Dr. Hale, we have a monitor spike on one of the infants. Dr. Harper's face went blank with terror. She ran, and I ran with her, knowing this nightmare was just beginning. The NICU was a blur of motion and flashing red lights. When Dr. Harper burst in, it felt like a warning, a sign that things were about to get worse. We converged on the incubator of her smallest baby, Oliver, the most vulnerable one. His oxygen levels had dropped. Dr. Harper clutched, her chest struggling for air. What's going on? I was already checking the ventilator. He's stable now, but someone messed with the incubator settings. The temperature was altered. Dr. Harper stared at me. Altered? Deliberately? I nodded grimly. This wasn't a malfunction. Someone did this. I saw the horror dawn on her. First her father, now this, an attack on a defenseless child. Just then, Dr. Hale came in. His face set like stone. He went straight to Oliver, assessing charts and giving orders with a calm authority that settled the room. Get me a full diagnostic. I want every single change logged and time-stamped, he commanded. And lock this unit down. Triple verification for everyone. For a second, his presence made things feel manageable. But then he turned to Dr. Harper, and I saw the cold fury in his eyes. Harper, he said softly. This wasn't him. She looked confused. How can you be sure? He held up a small evidence bag. Inside was a security badge, but it wasn't her father's or her ex-husband's. We found this under the incubator, Dr. Hale said. It's a duplicate access card. Dr. Harper's stomach must have been in knots. Whose is it? Dr. Hale paused, and in that silence you could feel her fear growing. It belongs to a night technician. He clocked out early. Dr. Harper frowned. Why? Because someone paid him, Dr. Hale said, his voice flat. And we need to find out who. Before she could process it, security rushed in. Dr. Hale, we have the technician, the supervisor said. He says he was just hired to create a distraction. My pulse hammered in my ears. A distraction for what? The supervisor glanced between them, hesitant. Dr. Hale gave him a sharp nod. He said a woman paid him. She wanted the mother distracted so someone could get close to the infants. He claimed it was a family issue. I saw Dr. Harper's face harden. A woman? Dr. Hale stiffened beside her. Describe her. He said she was in her 30s, tall, dark red hair, expensive clothing. Dr. Harper shook her head slowly. No, it can't be. But Dr. Hale was already connecting the dots. A chill ran through me. I knew of only one other woman who fit that description. Her whisper was barely audible. My father's second wife, Elena. Dr. Hale's eyes went wide. The final piece clicked into place. You said she never approved of you. That's putting it mildly, Dr. Harper breathed. She told me I ruined his life. Now she must think my children can fix it. Before he could reply, the intercom crackled. Dr. Hale, report to the main entrance. He looked at Dr. Harper, his expression grim. Stay put. Don't go anywhere. She just nodded, her hand gripping the incubator. As Dr. Hale left, a guard hurried in. Ma'am, he said, his voice urgent. You have to come. Someone is here, demanding to see you. My heart pounded. Who? The guard swallowed hard. A woman with red hair. And she says she isn't leaving without the babies. I watched Dr. Harper follow security down the hall. Every step looking like it took all her strength. I'd seen her stand up to so much already. Her ex, his sister, now this ghost from her past. But the woman waiting for her, Elena Sullivan, felt like a different kind of monster. The kind that smiles while they destroy you. When they got to the lobby, I saw her. Elena standing there as if she owned the place, wrapped in a deep red coat, her hair like fire. She radiated a cold, bitter entitlement. It wasn't power, it was poison. People just moved out of her way instinctively. I stayed back, hidden in the flow of hospital traffic, but I knew I had to be there. The moment Elena saw Dr. Harper, a cruel smile spread across her face. Well, look what we have here, she said, her voice like ice. The runaway has returned. I saw Dr. Harper flinch but hold her ground. What do you want, Elena? Elena glided closer, her heels clicking on the floor. I'm here for what's ours. Dr. Harper's voice was low but steady. My children are not yours or his. They are mine. Elena's smile never wavered. Patrick is dying. The words landed with brutal force. She explained he needed a stem cell treatment. A genetic match that only blood could provide. You want to use my babies? Dr. Harper said, her voice raw with disbelief. Just like he used me. I watched Elena's eyes go hard. As they faced off, I knew my time as a silent witness was over. I slipped away, pulled out my phone, and called security. This is an anonymous tip, I said, my voice steady. You need to find the note Patrick Sullivan dropped outside the NICU. It's a threat. Protect those children. It was a small act, but for the first time all day, I felt a glimmer of hope. I remember the first day it all fell apart. I was just stalking the linen cart down the hall. Their voices carried, sharp and angry. I heard the older woman, Elena, hiss that Harper owed him her life. But Harper's voice, though trembling, was strong. She spoke of abandonment, of a mother dying alone, of dreams she had to sacrifice. I should have called security then, but I just froze, hidden by the cart. Elena's cruelty was a physical thing in the air, calling Harper weak. And I'll never forget Harper's reply, quiet and fierce. Weak people don't survive what she survived. Before I could move, Dr. Rowan was there. He stood beside her, a silent, unbreachable wall of support. His focus on Elena was chilling. I heard his calm, even command for her to leave the hospital and never approach Harper or her children again. Elena's laugh was like shattering glass. Dr. Rowan simply handed a paper to security, a protective order, he called it. The smirk on Elena's face vanished. I watched her spit words of defiance, but it was hollow. Still, the look in her eyes as she stared at Harper was terrifyingly raw. She promised this wasn't over, that Harper would have no choice. Then Dr. Rowan's voice cut through the tension, cold as steel. Get out. As security led her away, Elena's final glare at Harper was a promise of future pain. I watched Harper finally exhale, the sound ragged and torn, and saw Dr. Rowan place a hand on her back. He told her it was over, but I saw Harper's eyes fixed on the doors. I knew she was right. People like Elena don't just leave, they regroup. The next day, hushed whispers confirmed it. Harper was meeting with lawyers from a big Manhattan firm, Fairchild and Lawson. I saw the documents being delivered to her room and felt a tiny spark of hope for her. I heard two other nurses talking about it at the station. It wasn't just about custody anymore. It was a full-blown strategy to protect her and those babies. I felt a surge of relief hearing they were filing restraining orders, even a criminal complaint. One of them said a technician had confessed, that the hospital was tracing the money back to Elena, and maybe even to the father. Harper's past was a storm she couldn't outrun, and it was finally breaking right here in our halls. I overheard Mara, the lawyer, mention another problem. A man named Cole. He was fighting the DNA results, trying to get to the triplets. I wanted to scream. I'd seen him myself, weeks ago, telling everyone those children weren't his. Now he wanted them. The nurses said his lawyer sent a letter, but that Harper had a legal document he'd signed refusing them. With his other troubles, they said he didn't stand a chance. It was a relief, but also so sad. He was just another person trying to use those innocent babies. Then I saw a special courier deliver a thick file to Dr. Rowan. It was about Harper's father. Something was wrong. I could feel it. The whispers started again, this time about him being sick, dying even. Genetic marrow. Failure, someone said. I saw the look on Harper's face when she read the report Dr. Rowan brought her. It was a look of profound, weary pain. So he was dying, and he thought one of his grandchildren could save him. Her children, the ones he never wanted. I couldn't imagine the weight of that choice. Later, I heard the lawyer, Mara, explaining something even more sinister about Elena's motives. Something about an inheritance she'd lose. If he lived, she got nothing. It clicked. Elena wasn't fighting for a husband. She was fighting for a fortune. Just as I was processing that, Dr. Rowan came running down the hall, looking for Harper. He said security found something new on the cameras. My heart pounded. I thought it had to be about Elena, but he shook his head. It was about her father. He hadn't been acting alone. And that's when my own memory surfaced, a detail from earlier that I had dismissed. The father, looking ill and desperate, talking to someone. Cole. I knew what they were going to see on that tape. I watched from a distance as Dr. Rowan showed her the security stills. I couldn't make out the image, but I saw the color drain from Harper's face. The father she tried to forget, and the man who broke her heart were now working together against her. I felt sick with guilt. I had seen them talking near the west exit, a tense, hushed exchange. An envelope passed between them. It was a deal, a betrayal captured in a grainy photograph. I heard her whisper, asking what was in it. Cash, Dr. Rowan said, and a plan. He was supposed to get a DNA sample from one of the babies for Cole's new claim. My hands clenched. He sold access to his own grandchildren. I overheard Mara explaining Cole's new legal angle, painting Harper as unstable. It was disgusting. After all he'd done, he was trying to play the victim. But seeing Harper then, she wasn't a victim. She looked like a fighter. Dr. Rowan's voice was like iron when he vowed Cole would never get near them. They were going to fight back, and they were going to be smart about it. Publicly, Harper straightened her shoulders. She asked what they needed. Her truth, the lawyer said. The whole story. And I watched as she gave it to them, her voice clear and strong, turning years of pain into a weapon. Dr. Rowan never left her side, his presence a silent anchor in her storm. When she was done, Mara closed her notebook, confident they could get the court's protection. But, just as a flicker of relief entered the room, I saw Dr. Rowan's expression shift. There was still more bad news to come. I could practically feel her spirit bracing for another hit. "You can take it," he told her gently. And then he showed her the memo. I saw the words on the top. An internal hospital complaint. Filed by Cole. Against Dr. Rowan. Accusing him of improper conduct. With her. Harper shot to her feet, her denial echoing in the small room. It was a lie. A desperate, dirty move to isolate her. "I won't let him," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "We'll fight it," Dr. Rowan promised. And that's when I knew what I had to do. As they huddled over the new file, I slipped a note onto a nearby cart. "Check west exit camera, 2 p.m. Cole and Patrick." It was a small act, but it wasn't silence. I still remember the first time I saw her, crumpled and bleeding, and the coldness in his eyes. It's a memory that's haunted me for weeks, a ghost in my quiet moments. So when I saw her walk toward the courthouse, I knew I had to be here. A sudden call had pulled them all in for an emergency session. 30 minutes notice, they said. Her fate, their fate, was hanging by a thread, and he was in there, waiting. The air inside felt heavy, thick with the scent of old files and the chill of the street. She walked between her lawyer and the doctor. A silent, determined trio cutting through the hushed hall. I could see her hands were clenched, her stomach probably in knots, but she stood tall. She wasn't playing the victim. She was there as a fighter. Inside, he was already settled next to his lawyer, that familiar smug look back on his face, like a shadow that never quite leaves. Dressed in a sharp suit, hair perfect, he looked like a man who thought he owned every room he entered. But his gaze faltered when she walked in. It wasn't guilt I saw, but a flicker of fear. He saw it too. The change in her, the resolve that wouldn't let her be small anymore. She didn't even look his way. She sat with her lawyer, while the doctor stood guard behind her, a solid, unmoving presence. Then the judge appeared. A stern woman whose presence alone silenced the room. "This urgent hearing," she stated, "concerns temporary custody, allegations against Dr. Rowan Hale, and the safety of the infants in the neonatal unit." I felt my own heart pound for her, 3 wars on one battlefield. His lawyer stood first. "Your Honor, my client has been unjustly kept from his children. Miss Sullivan and Dr. Hale plotted to strip him of his rights. Their scheme was deliberate, aimed at erasing him as a father." I watched the doctor's jaw tighten. "Moreover," the lawyer pressed on, "we believe Dr. Hale formed an improper emotional bond with a patient in a vulnerable state." Her lawyer shot up, her chair scraping loudly. "Objection. We have a mountain of proof showing Mr. Maddox fabricated stories to cover his own desertion and gross neglect." She presented a binder so thick it made the judge blink. It was filled with his signed refusal of parental rights. Statements from half the hospital staff, security clips of him shouting in the NICU corridor, and that other nurse's confession about the falsified records. The judge scanned the pages, her face becoming a stony mask. "Mr. Maddox, is this your signature here?" He gulped. I was confused." "That wasn't the question." "Yes," he mumbled. "And you left the hospital while your partner was in high-risk labor. I didn't think they were my kids." That is no justification for abandonment, the judge cut him off. I saw Dr. Hale rest a comforting hand on the back of her chair. She didn't turn, but I saw the tension ease from her shoulders, just a little. Then her lawyer spoke again. Your Honor, we also have proof that Mr. Maddox recently conspired with Patrick Sullivan, a man with a pending restraining order, to unlawfully get DNA from the NICU. Their plot nearly caused serious harm to a baby. Murmurs filled the room. His face flushed a deep, ugly red. That's not true. Dr. Hale held up the security photos. This was captured 3 hours before they tried to breach the unit. His lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a sharp wave of her hand. Be seated. He collapsed back into his chair, seething. The judge leaned in. Based on this, temporary custody stays with Miss Sullivan. Mr. Maddox is granted no visitation pending a full investigation. I watched her exhale, a wave of relief so powerful, I almost felt it myself. But the judge wasn't done. Regarding the claims against Dr. Hale, she said, looking at him, this court sees no evidence of misconduct. His intervention, in fact, likely saved Miss Sullivan's life. The doctor let out a slow breath, the weight lifting from him. Then the judge got to the last section of the binder, and her brow furrowed. This is concerning, she said quietly. I saw Harper tense up. What's happened? The judge's eyes were like steel. Miss Sullivan, did you know your father submitted a petition right before this hearing? The air went cold. He's asking for emergency guardianship. Dr. Hale moved forward. Your Honor, that man is... The judge stopped him. I have not made a ruling, but his petition contains a sworn statement with some very serious accusations against Miss Sullivan. Her pulse was probably roaring. Accusations? The judge shut the file, and the individual providing this testimony is known to you. I held my breath, watching her tremble. Mr. Maddox, the judge called out, please come forward. He stood up, but it was like he was being pulled by strings, all his earlier confidence gone. For the first time, he didn't look angry or slick, just cornered. I watched him walk to the stand, and my own heart hammered in my chest. Whatever fresh lie this was, I could feel the trap closing around her again. The judge peered over her glasses. Mr. Maddox, you provided a sworn statement to support Patrick Sullivan's guardianship claim. Is that correct? He cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. Her lawyer's posture went rigid. And in that statement, the judge went on, you paint Miss Sullivan as unstable, irresponsible, and unfit to be a parent. I watched her absorb those words, her face a mask of control. He added, Your Honor, I was worried about the children. She wouldn't let me see them. Because you signed away your rights, the judge reminded him sharply. He stumbled over his words. The doctor looked like he was about to explode. Her lawyer stepped in. Your Honor, permission to cross-examine? Proceed, the judge allowed. She moved toward him, calm and precise. Mr. Maddox, you say she's unstable. On what grounds? He paused. She passed out in labor. From blood loss, the lawyer corrected. Due to a high-risk pregnancy, not a character flaw. His jaw worked. She made bad decisions. Like what? She kept the triplets a secret from me until after the second ultrasound. I watched Harper squeeze her eyes shut. I knew why she'd waited. She'd been terrified he would destroy her hope. The lawyer's voice grew colder. And yet, you told first responders she wasn't your wife, that she was just some woman trying to trap you. Did you not say that? The color drained from his face. The whispers started again. The judge leaned forward. Is this accurate? He stammered, I was told things. Verena said, "Ah, yes," the lawyer said. "Verena Lowe, who is now facing charges for data fraud and misconduct." He swallowed, trapped. "And Patrick Sullivan," she continued, "a man who deserted his own child, who used a stolen ID inside a hospital, and who tried to break into a secure medical ward. This is who Mr. Maddox supports for guardianship." The judge's face was granite. "Mr. Maddox, are you aware of how this appears?" His desperation finally boiled over into rage. "I was set up," he yelled. "She lied to me for years. She knew I couldn't have children." "False," the doctor bit out. "Your fertility was fine. The files were tampered with." The judge scowled. "Mr. Maddox, approach." He walked forward unsteady. Her voice dropped, low and intense. But the fury was unmistakable. "You left your wife during a catastrophic labor. You tried to force your way into a secure neonatal ward. You conspired with a man under investigation, and you are still trying to take newborns from their mother." Her voice grew sharp again. "You have zero credibility." His eyes went wide, real panic finally showing. She raised her voice so the whole court could hear. "I am ordering a full criminal probe into your activities and your association with Patrick Sullivan." A collective gasp went through the room. I watched Harper breathe again, slow and uneven. He slumped into his chair, his hands shaking. The judge flipped through more papers. "This petition from Patrick Sullivan is built on lies, baseless accusations, and fabricated claims. It is therefore—" Before she could rule, the doors flew open. A court officer rushed in, whispering urgently to the judge. Her face changed from confusion to alarm. She stood. "Miss Sullivan, Dr. Hale, you need to come with me. Now." My blood ran cold. "What's wrong?" The judge looked straight at her, her voice heavy. "It's about the babies." Dr. Hale's hand clamped onto her chair. The judge said, "They're missing from the NICU." The world dissolved into chaos. One second I was frozen in my seat. The next she was a blur, running down the hospital hall, her breathing torn and painful. She moved on pure instinct, outrunning reason, outrunning the doctor shouting her name behind her. Her babies were gone, taken from the one place they were supposed to be safe. Alarms were screaming, red lights flashing everywhere, staff were running, their faces masks of panic. "Secure the exits, lock down everything." Then it hit me, a memory from earlier. And without thinking, I pushed through the crowd toward him. "Dr. Hale," I choked out. "I saw something. Bustle." I remember the first time I saw the true fear in her eyes, right after the code was called. "This can't be happening," she whispered, and I felt the words like a punch. "Not my babies." He tried to steady her, but I saw the tremor in his own hands, the lie in his confident tone. My heart pounded as I stepped forward, tablet in hand, to deliver the worst news. "The cameras? They're dark," I managed to say. Someone cut the feed. I watched the last bit of color drain from her face and felt the weight of what I hadn't said for weeks. I saw her mind racing, searching for an enemy she couldn't name. And then I had to give her the note I found tucked inside the empty bassinet. My own hands were shaking. Her blood ran cold, but I think mine froze completely. He snatched it from her, his jaw tight. "It's a trap." Before the words even settled, the security radio on my hip crackled to life. A frantic voice confirming our worst fears. A man in scrubs, with 2 carriers, heading for the old loading dock, and my guilt turned into a cold, hard stone in my gut. I watched them sprint down that flickering, forgotten corridor, a place where only ghosts and bad memories usually went. I couldn't follow. My post was here, my duty was here. A security guard ran past me, breathless. "We found the 3rd carrier," he yelled back at them. "It's empty," I heard her cry out, a sound that will haunt me forever. Then she was gone, through the heavy doors and out into the biting wind, chasing a nightmare I had watched gather like a storm cloud and had done nothing to prevent. I didn't see what she saw in that alley, but I heard it. The roar of an engine, a sound of pure desperation. I heard her scream their names. And then, a single gunshot cracked through the night, sharp and final. The sound bounced off the brick, echoing back into the hospital. A sound that felt like a judgment against my silence. I knew about her father. I knew about Cole. I had seen the signs, and I had looked away. That gunshot was the price of my cowardice. And in that awful moment, I knew I would have to pay it. The man who fired wasn't aiming to kill, I learned later. He was aiming to stop. The screech of blown tires was followed by the sickening crunch of metal. Chaos. From the doorway, I could see the flashing lights painting the alley in frantic strobes of red and blue. Doors were thrown open. Figures stumbled out into the cold. The nightmare was no longer a shadow. It was real, and it was violent, and it was happening right there. My silence had helped build this moment, piece by agonizing piece. I saw him then, her father, collapsing to his knees, offering the carrier like a penance. A broken man, and I saw Rowan tackle Cole. A righteous fury I had never seen in a doctor before. Cole screamed curses, blaming her, but his words were empty now. Everyone could see the monster behind the mask, the one I'd seen glimpses of and ignored. As security swarmed him, I knew my time for silence was over. What I knew wasn't just gossip anymore. It was evidence. It was truth. The third baby was safe. Another nurse, braver than I was, had grabbed him in the confusion. I watched Harper fall to her knees, clutching her children. A sound of pure, gut-wrenching relief tearing from her throat. Rowan was there, holding her together. It was then I made the call. I told the head of security that I had information, that I needed to make a statement. The fear was still there, but for the first time, my resolve was stronger. I would not let them be erased by my inaction. Let me ask you something. When Harper was lying on that table, bleeding, alone, with the man she loved telling her that her children weren't his, who do you think she was in that moment? A victim? A fool? A woman who should have known better? No. She was every woman who has ever loved someone so deeply that she forgot to protect herself. She was every mother who put her children first and her own pain second. She was every person who looked at the warning signs and chose hope instead of fear. Not because she was stupid, but because she believed love was supposed to be safe. And that is the first lesson of this story. Love is not always safe, but that does not mean you are wrong to give it. Cole Maddox didn't just betray his wife, he betrayed the very idea of partnership. He stood in a hospital where his children were fighting for their first breaths, and he chose his pride over their lives. He believed a lie. Not because the evidence was strong, but because the lie was easier. It was easier to call Harper a liar than to face the truth that he had failed her. It was easier to walk away than to walk through the fire beside her. And that is the second lesson. The cruelest betrayals don't come from enemies. They come from the people who promise to stand beside you. But let's talk about Verena. Because Verena is the person in this story that should terrify you the most. She didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She smiled. She whispered. She waited. She forged medical records. She rewrote a man's entire identity to serve her obsession. She stood next to Harper and called it kindness while plotting her destruction. Verena is proof that the most dangerous people in your life will never look dangerous. They will look helpful. They will look like a friend, a colleague, a shoulder to lean on, and by the time you see the knife, it's already in your back. The third lesson: pay attention to the people who seem to benefit from your pain. If someone is always nearby when things fall apart, ask yourself, Are they helping you, or are they the reason things keep breaking? Now, let's talk about Patrick Sullivan, Harper's father, the man who vanished for 15 years and reappeared the moment his grandchildren could be useful to him. He didn't come back out of love. He came back because he was dying, and he needed what Harper's children could give him: a genetic match, a cure, a second chance he never earned. He didn't knock on the front door. He stole an identity. He snuck into a hospital. He wrote a note that said, "Don't make this harder than it has to be." That is not a father. That is a predator wearing a father's face. And the fourth lesson is perhaps the hardest one. Not everyone who shares your blood deserves a place in your life. Family is not a birthright. It is a choice you earn every single day by showing up, by being present, by putting someone else's well-being above your own convenience. Patrick Sullivan forfeited that right 15 years ago. His illness didn't restore it. But here's where this story turns from tragedy into something extraordinary. Because Harper did not break. She bent, she bled. She flatlined on a hospital table. She watched her children get kidnapped from the one place they were supposed to be safe. She faced her absent father, her cheating husband, a woman who wanted to erase her, and a stepmother who wanted to sell her children's bodies for an inheritance. And she stood up. She put on a green dress. She walked into that boardroom. She looked the man who nearly destroyed her in the eye, and she did not beg. She did not cry. She laid the truth on that table like a weapon, and she watched his empire collapse under the weight of his own lies. That is the fifth lesson, and it is the one I want you to carry with you long after this story ends. You are not defined by what was done to you. You are defined by what you do after. Harper could have stayed broken. Nobody would have blamed her. But she chose to fight, not with cruelty, not with revenge, but with the truth. And the truth, when it finally comes out, is louder than any lie ever spoken. And let's not forget Dr. Rowan Hale, because Rowan is the quiet hero of this story. He didn't save Harper because he wanted something from her. He saved her because it was right. He signed the guardianship papers when no one else would. He paid for a lawyer she couldn't afford. He stood between her and every threat, not because she was weak, but because she deserved to not fight alone. Rowan reminds us of the sixth lesson. Real strength isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about protecting someone who has no one else. And finally, the nurses, the silent witnesses, the ones who saw the rot and said nothing until their silence became unbearable. One of them slipped a note onto a cart. One grabbed a baby during the chaos. One made a phone call that changed everything. They weren't heroes from the beginning. They were afraid. They were unsure. They told themselves it wasn't their place. But in the end, they chose to speak. And that is the final, most important lesson of all. Your silence has a cost. Every time you see something wrong and look away, you are not staying neutral. You are choosing a side. And it is never too late to choose the right one. So, tonight, as you close your eyes, I want you to think about this. Who in your life is fighting a battle alone? Who is being lied about, pushed aside, made to feel small? And what would happen if you, just you, decided to say something? You don't have to be a doctor. You don't have to be a lawyer. You just have to be someone who refuses to stay silent. That is the story of Harper Sullivan, a mother, a survivor, a woman who proved that even when the whole world turns against you, the truth, and the people brave enough to speak it, will always find a way. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Like this video if you believe that every mother deserves to be protected. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they are stronger than they think, and subscribe to this channel, because every week we bring you stories that will break your heart and rebuild it stronger. I'll see you in the next one. This content has been carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful life lessons and emotional value to our audience. All characters, names, locations, and events in this story are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual events is purely coincidental. This story is created for entertainment and educational purposes only, intended to inspire reflection on themes of trust, betrayal, resilience, and the power of truth. Viewer discretion is advised.